Certainly, for honor. Certainly, of course, for honor. Certainly, for honor. Of course, a sound plan. Of course. Certainly, for honor. Certainly, for honor. Justice is come. Of course, a sound plan. Certainly, for honor. A sound plan.
Allied town is under siege.
Of course, for honor.
You are past the death.
Of course, a sound plan.
Justice is coming.
Of course,
Feel my wrath.
a sound plan. For honor. Of course, the violence must wait.
Foul name.
For honor.
You are past the death. Betrayer of the light.
A sound plan.
Justice is coming. Foul name.
Certainly. Of course.
Betrayer of the light. Feel my wrath.
For honor. Certainly.
Betrayer of the light.
A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course.
Foul name. Feel my wrath.
A sound plan.
You are past the death.
Of course.
Feel my wrath. Justice is coming.
A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For Lord Orion. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan.
今早
Of course.
半年没看我打三国了，
A
打到
sound
60岁，太夸张了吧？
Of course. For
这么
honor.
久吗？
A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly.
Betrayer of the light.
For honor. Certainly. Foul. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan.
Feel my wrath.
A sound plan.
For Lord Orion. Foul.
Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly.
Betrayer of the light. Feel my wrath. You are past the death.
A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly.
For my father, the king.
Of course.
Betrayer of the light.
Certainly. A sound plan. Of course.
Allied hero has
Certainly.
fallen.
Of course.
Allied town is under siege.
For honor.
You are past the death.
A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan.
Betrayer of the light.
For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Is there danger? Justice shall be done. I'm here to help. The light is my strength. I stand for the light. The light is my strength. Of course, for honor. A sound plan. For honor.
转，这本尊来，哎，这本尊呢，干被转4下哎，
Certainly.
看才短短2秒钟转了4下哎，
For honor. Of course. A sound plan.
You are past the death.
Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan.
Feel my wrath.
Of course.
Justice.
Of foul name. For honor, of course. Justice has come. For honor.
You are past the end.
A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan.
Allies get ready.
A sound plan. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For Lord. Of course. Certainly. Of
Our
course.
allies' tower is under siege.
Is there danger? A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. I'm here to help. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly.
Justice has come.
A sound plan. Foul name. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course.
Betrayer of the light.
Certainly. A sound plan. For honor.
Justice has come. Betrayer of the light.
Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Feel my wrath. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course.
Betrayer of the light.
For Lord of
Allies get ready.
For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan.
Betrayer of the light.
Certainly.
抽点，
Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For my father. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. I stand for the light.
The restless dead await.
啊，先把黄十字点满
Sound
吧。
plan. I stand for the light. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly.
Justice has come. Betrayer of the light.
A sound plan.
Justice has come. Betrayer of the light.
Of course.
You are past.
For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For Lord.
死了，拜。在这边卡兵，
Of course. For my father. For honor. Of course.
Our hero has fallen.
然后阴影没跳到，感觉可以杀没震到，可惜。
I stand for the light.
Our allies' town is
A
under
sound
siege.
plan. Of course. A sound plan.
他好想学，应该是要骗想学。如果第一排有骗想学的话，第二排跟过去按退刀， 应该是有机会杀的。
for honor,
不过没骗到就没办法。
a sound
Betrayer of the light.
for honor, a sound plan. For honor, of course,
Feel my wrath.
certainly. For honor, of course, for honor, certainly. A sound plan. For honor,
抓到了，
I stand.
水哦，
Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For my father the king. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Foul name. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan.
You are past redemption.
For honor.
Our allied hero has fallen.
A sound for honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound
Feel my wrath.
certainly. A sound plan.
Betrayer of the light.
Of course. Certainly. A sound plan.
再一波我去买一下，
For honor.
Feel
买
my
一些黄忠弓，现在弓数不够。
Certainly. Of course.
justice of honor. Betrayer of the light. Justice of honor. Betrayer of the light.
A sound plan. Certainly. Of course.
上
Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A
买一下
sound
吧。
plan. Of course. I'm here to help. Certainly. Of course. I stand for the light. Certainly.
What does
Is there
the
danger?
shadow will?
For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan.
You are past.
Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor.
不能追哦，他5张还有。
Betrayer of the light.
A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For Lord or honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course.
You are past redemption. Feel my Our allied town is under siege.
For honor. Of course. For honor. A
小兵
sound
不要漏。
I stand for the light. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For my father. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan.
Betrayer of the light.
Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course.
这塔好像可以拔掉，飞走了。
Certainly. Of course. Feel my wrath. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Justice shall be done. Certainly. Foul name. A sound plan. Certainly.
差一点。
For honor. Of course.
不过他也补血了，也是杀不死的。
A sound plan. Certainly. For my father. Justice is come. You are past the death. Justice is come. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan.
买一下吧，
Light is my strength.
先把神钩买出来。
For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course.
Our allies' town is under siege.
Certainly. For honor. I'm here to help. Is there danger? Certainly. I stand for the light.
Our allies' town is under siege.
接这个呗。
Of course. I'm here to help.
看一下，高顺宝护罩没？应该是还没有护罩。
Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly.
哇，死了！
Allies' hero has fallen.
A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan.
后期才有伤害，没有，我们现在伤害其实够啊。你看我们现在2件装，因为20分钟2件这2件装备是够的。
Town is under siege.
A sound plan. Of course. For honor. For my father. For honor. Foul name. Certainly. For honor. Betrayal of light. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. I stand for the light. For honor.
Justice has come. Feel my wrath.
Of course. Certainly. A sound plan.
Our allies' town is under siege.
Of course. Certainly. For honor. Is there danger? A sound plan. Of course. For my father. Justice shall be done. sound plan. Of course. For
再2000扣。
I'm here to help. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For my father the king. A sound plan. For honor.
Hero has fallen. You are past redemption. Feel my wrath.
For honor. Certainly. A sound plan.
Our hero has
你要先跑、哦，都有5张哦。哇，这个打下去会开视野哦。
Our allies' town is under siege.
他灵魂剑啊，这个曹操套路都是固定的啊，他没有一场不是这样出的，每一次都是降靴，然后5张，然后灵魂剑，
Is under siege.
永远都是固定套路的。
For honor.
哎呦，可以追吗？
Our allies' town is under siege.
Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Battle. Of course. A sound plan.
Our allies' town is under siege.
A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. I'm here to help. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound
Our
plan.
allies' town is
Of
under
course.
siege.
Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor.
Feel my wrath. You are past. Our allies' hero
A
has
sound
fallen.
plan. For honor. A sound plan.
Allies' hero has fallen.
Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Is there danger? I'm here to help. Of course. A sound plan.
Our
Bow.
allies' town is under siege.
Certainly.
哦，还差一点点呢。
For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly.
You are past redemption. Justice. Our allies' town is under siege.
A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. I stand. Certainly.
Our allies' town is
Sound
under
plan.
siege.
哇，别人要死了，5张。
For my father. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor.
Our allies' town is under siege.
For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For Lord of A sound plan. Of course.
Our allies' town is under siege.
I stand for the light. Of course. Certainly. Of course.
推一波吧，
Of course.
我觉得可以走一起。他们那个没有
A sound plan.
啊，他们刚刚拖后期啊，我这边直接 A 掉吧。
A sound plan. Of course. A
哎，刮刮！
Of course. A sound plan. For Lord Oran. For honor. A sound plan.
Our allies' town is under siege.
Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Is there danger? A sound plan. Of course. A sound
Our hero has fallen. Our hero has fallen.
被太死刮了。
Our forces are under attack.
等一下换推个钟吧。给你怎么装？七星魂枪。
I stand for the light. Of course. Is there danger? The light is my strength.
Our allies' town is under siege.
For honor. A sound plan.
Go go.
Of course.
Our allies' town is under siege.
For honor. A sound plan.
Feel my wrath.
Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course.
Our forces are under attack.
For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. From Father. Certainly. Of course.
You are passive.
A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course.
我顺势推，顺势推。
A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For Lord Oran.
Our allies' hero has fallen.
Of course. Certainly.
Go go。
Certainly. A sound plan.
Betrayer of the light. Our forces are under attack.
军营吧，感觉可以中军营加短军加下军营，下路只有军营的。
The light is my strength. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Justice has come. Foul knave. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. You are certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly.
可以猜吧？这样他们少了3个人，还2个人。原因刮起来，草就会刮起来。下一把，我应该会那个吧？我感觉可以出月下欸。
Justice shall be done. Certainly.
A
Allies' hero has fallen.
The light is my strength. For honor.
Of course. A sound plan. Our allies' hero has fallen.
I stand for the light. Is there danger?
Certainly.
I stand.
这银两不知道多少钱，看一下
Our forces are under
I'm here to
attack.
help.
哦。
A sound plan.
其实还好，他们也很有钱。
Stand
我想要看他们的装备，他都没有回家买装备，我以为他有7、8千块，
Of course.
结果只
A
有
sound plan.
4000多块而已。
Of course.
先吃再喊
For。honor. A sound plan.
Of course.
Certainly. For honor. A sound plan.
Of course.
Certainly. A sound plan. I'm here to help. For honor.
加点吃吧。
A sound. I stand for the light. Certainly. Justice shall be done. For honor.
Of course.
Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan.
那你就这样不见了。
For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan.
我要离开一点，不然等下被刮到龙心。
A sound plan.
Justice.
Foul name. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor.